And of course, he cannot be. That's how he picked up these 37 federal charges. The indictment suggests that Trump uses his access to sensitive materials to show off and to settle scores at minimum. And the documents that are the subject of this protective order are things like grand jury testimony, witness interviews, financial data, not even classified materials, but DOJ still doesn't want Trump looking at them without adult supervision. And Ali, Trump's lawyers didn't fight this because they know they wouldn't have a case. Right.
And they also know that if the judge doesn't tell them to do it, it was the same thing in the E. Jean Carroll case in New York. Unless the judge gives instructions, Donald Trump tends to do what he wants to do. And Glenn, that was actually part of the problem because some people wanted Donald Trump not to be able to be in contact with either co-defendants or witnesses in this case, except when you read this indictment, the co-defendants and witnesses in many cases are people who are around him all the time. So even the prosecutors sort of said, fine, he can talk, he can be around them. They just can't talk about this case. This is interesting. His co-defendant, Walt Nauta, is with him all the time. He's his body man.
Yeah. So, Ali, how do you police a court order that says, you know, Walt and Donald can't talk with one another about the case, but they can have private conversations about everything else? Who's going to report a violation of that? Not Walt, not Donald. So, you know, I wonder the efficacy of a court order or a prohibition like that. But, you know, you make a great point about the witnesses who we saw in the indictment. Now, they weren't named, but they were identified. Some of the most sharply incriminating witnesses against Donald Trump are who? Trump lawyer number 1, Trump lawyer number 2, Trump lawyer number 3, Trump employee number 1, number 2. You know, Donald Trump loves to complain that the people who are always going after him are an angry group of Democrats. Well, you know what? He's not going to have that complaint available to him at his criminal trial because it's going to be his lawyers and former lawyers, his employees, his former employees who are providing the lion's share of the incriminating information. Boy, that makes it very tough to mount a defense that all the prosecution witnesses are out to get me.
Paul Butler, I'm fascinated both in Trump world, where Donald Trump himself said at a rally this weekend, I had a right to have those boxes, given that the indictment is very specific about speeches Donald Trump has made in which he expresses his fairly sophisticated understanding of how to handle classified material. He absolutely knew what he was and wasn't supposed to have. And the fact that there doesn't seem to be any Republican who's defending him who has an argument on the facts, right? On the intent and the act of taking these boxes, knowing that you weren't supposed to have them. Nobody seems to have a defense about this. There's a lot of defenses that involve Hillary Clinton. There's a lot of defenses that involve Hunter Biden. There's a lot of defenses that talk about the weaponization of the federal government, but very few have anything to do with Donald Trump not supposed to be having those boxes.
No defense on the merits. Looking at the very compelling and incriminating indictment, it's hard to know how Trump would defend on the facts. His original defense was that he unclassified the documents, but the indictment refers to an audio tape where Trump himself seems to contradict that. You know, Ali, there's always a tension when an elected official or a candidate for office is indicted. It's unique now in the sense of the president, but it's a familiar problem for defense attorneys when they represent people like mayors or Congress folks. The advice they get from their political advisors is often conflicting with what they hear from their defense attorneys. And in the case of United States versus Donald Trump, we're seeing that tension on steroids. His lawyers are almost certainly telling him to shut up. There's nothing that a defendant can say that will help them in court, whether they're innocent or they're guilty. Lawyers want to do all the talking. But politically, often people who are candidates for office feel they have to talk. They need an explanation for voters about how they'll answer the charges. And as we've seen from Donald Trump, he may also use this case as a fundraising opportunity.
I want to ask you, Glenn, about the E. Jean Carroll